You are listening to the Unsoberly Sober Show. I'm your host, Magnify Maggie. This podcast will turn your perception of going sober upside down. We're going to be working from the inside out to get you that dream life. So make sure you stick around for the end of the episode where I'm going to walk you through our weekly positive pursuit exercise to begin rewiring that beautiful mind, baby. Last time we came together and talked about children of alcoholics and adult children of alcoholics, there was so much growth for so many of you. I got an abundant amount of messages just from listeners, from followers on Instagram and TikTok saying that conversation was really eye-opening, understanding that the things that happen to us as kids, especially in the home of parents who are drinking, what happened to us can be healed, but it also helps us understand why we might be living and thinking and acting the way we do as adults, turning that perception on its head of, I must be doing this because of genetics. If you are like me and you grew up in that type of environment, again, going back to that first conversation, it's really likely that you were taught and conditioned to believe that because your mom or your dad was a quote unquote alcoholic, that you are genetically predisposed to it. And I want to paint that picture of like what that did to me. Every time I tried to stop drinking, I would be walking past the little bar cart in our house or, trying to just stop at one drink when I went out with my girlfriends. But there was this narrative in the back of my mind, this conditioning that, well, it's a disease. I have this disease. This is my genetics. There's nothing I can do about it. So why fight it? Why even try to go against it? Let me just embrace it, YOLO. So it almost became this narrative that perpetuated my behavior. But that's not always the case. And I'll say for some people, it's more frustrating because they did not have parents that were drinking. They did not have that traditional environment of needing to parent their parents. They did not have that environment of, coming home and walking on eggshells depending on whether or not mom or dad was drinking. And that can still be so frustrating, saying, why am I drinking this way? I didn't have that quote unquote family history of addiction. I had parents who remained married. I had a roof over my head. I had food on the table and clothes to wear. Why am I struggling with addiction? So today's conversation, I'm trying to fit in a lot of pieces because in my mind, they make so much sense together, but it's still maybe half-baked. So let's just dive in. Follow along with me here. So I've talked a lot about my mom, and even when I listen back to some of the episodes, I can hear how it might come across as like I'm very judgmental or angry, or I still have a lot of rage around, my childhood because of her. But something that I've learned to do is to look at her with deep compassion, because she was actually somebody who did not grow up in a household with addiction. My grandfather was a coal miner's son that grew up in the Great Depression. And his childhood was filled with needing to be perfect, needing to work very hard, providing for the family at a young age because of, the financial instability. As he grew up, he became, looking back as I can see it, very addicted to success. He did not have any drinks in my memory, even after I was born. But what my mom says, he never drank. My grandmother never drank. When my mom would talk about her childhood, she would try to rationalize, I don't know why I have this problem because my parents didn't drink and we had all of these nice things and I should be happy. And that's really where a lot of people find themselves. They call it little t trauma. Why am I like this when my childhood looked okay? But the truth of the matter is that it's so much more than any kind of family history of addiction. It's so much more than any kind of genetic predisposition. And I'm taking a page out of Dr. Gabor Maté's programs and education here, that it's not about what happened, but how you feel about what happened. So there are people who are born to families of addiction, families with the history of addiction, where they don't have a problem. And then there are people that do. There's also people that are born to families that are successful and seem like they got their shit straight, that have a problem with addiction. And there's also people that don't. It has less to do with the family history of whether or not there is a genetic alcoholic thing that you're going to get. It's about that environment. It's about the heredity of the culture of your family. So with that being said, my mom growing up was the only girl, 2 brothers. My grandfather, I would say, was a little old school, as you can imagine. And, he really looked at his sons as the shining stars. And my mom was taught to kind of take on masculine roles within the family, and she wasn't able to express herself and be girly and want to, be feminine. And so I think there were parts of her that she couldn't be authentic in her childhood, even though, they had dinner, they had, family events, they had all of these hokey dokey Kodak picture perfect family lifestyle things going on. There wasn't a connection with herself. She always had to be somebody in order to receive love from my grandfather. This is something that I also experienced when I moved in with my grandpa, when my mom's drinking got extreme. I know that what I went through was what she went through, but with her dad versus my grandfather. So it was a lot more extreme for her. No, they never drank, but they expected perfection from her. They expected her to be working very hard to receive external validation. And I don't think that they did. And again, this is with compassion to my grandparents, because they were just doing what they were taught to do growing up, in such a different time. They were, holding her to extremely high standards. And anything that she did, it was never like celebrating what she did, but rather the one thing that she did wrong. I remember stories of her, telling me how she finally made the cheerleading squad, and my grandpa would show up and be kind of lethargic. He wasn't really into it like he was for my uncle's basketball games or football games. He would just be there, and he would be physically present but not mentally present. And at the end of her dance or her choreography, he would say, "Yeah, but I saw that you stepped out of line in this one dance." Or I saw, when she started going after track, running track, she would, come in second. And he would say, "Yeah, but it wasn't first." So through all of these different ways that she was conditioned, she had this self-image created that I'm not good enough. I can't be the real me. And no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to amount to much. And that took a lot of my own reflection and learning on conditioning and the mental environment that's created from our childhood experiences to understand that it doesn't have to look like experiencing death or abuse or addiction, dysfunction to that nature in the home. It can look like neglect. It can look like not getting the praise and the approval that we need as children. I had this question from a listener. Thank you for posting this on YouTube. What is your response to someone who's an alcoholic who was not raised in a home with alcohol or drugs? And that's exactly the storyline that I'm pulling from is, I have my story, but my mom's story is so similar with a completely different childhood experience, with what seemed to be a very nurturing home if you looked at it from the outside. But when you get to know the actual emotional experience of her as a child, you see that would make sense. If somebody doesn't know how to authentically be themselves, they will lean on a tool to help them feel more confident in being authentic. If somebody doesn't know how to handle coming in second, and to look at that with positivity, or to look at, mishaps with, I learned not to do it that way versus, I must be bad because I messed up. When we don't have that kind of conditioning in that environment to learn that our mistakes don't define us, then it would make sense that we lean on alcohol to escape from that pain of failure, of mishaps, of this identity of I'm somebody who, no matter how hard I try, I'm always going to fail. My response to this person saying, what about someone who was not raised in a home with addiction? I said, well, I would ask, what is their childhood like? But not from a physical standpoint of, well, we had a nice house and we had money and my parents had jobs and they were married. It's not just those things that make a childhood good. It's the culture of the home. So I said, what did their childhood look like? It's not always alcohol or that dysfunction that causes trauma. If a parent is anxious or depressed about anything, as a child, you are going to be hardwired. Your nervous system will be, I'll use this word accurately, your nervous system will be predisposed to always gearing for anxiety, no matter what that stressor is, even if, to the outside world, they could look at this stressor and see an easy solution. If you grew up in a home where your parents were very anxious or nervous or even sad and depressed, then you're going to be hardwired to have that perception about things all of your life, no matter what the case is. Let's say if a parent is stressed about their weight or their body image issues, you are going to basically inherit that. Not genetically, environmentally. These things leave imprints on the child's nervous system. I said they will be wired for anxiety or perfectionism or whatever the parents dealt with and modeled. And of course, if someone is hardwired for anxiety or perfectionism, it will make sense to look for soothing, comfort, and escape. And so the key theme that I think makes a child strong to the point where when they mature, they don't lean on anything outside of them to make them feel good is learning emotional regulation. So it's really easy to say, okay, outside of those physical things of the nice house and the happily married, quote unquote, happily married parents and everything, what did I see around emotional regulation? Were my parents easily triggered? Were my parents hyper-reactive to stress? Were my parents catastrophizing everything? Because it doesn't require somebody to be an alcoholic to catastrophize things, to get very nervous about things that are coming up. That emotional regulation is key in childhood development. And it's not just drinkers that are emotionally unregulated. But when you look at the feeling of the home, were you, even if everything was fine and alcohol wasn't even present, were you expected to get A++++? I know when, my grandpa took us in, my mom was doing her own thing, not able to take care of us, I would bring home A-. And my grandfather would say, why wasn't this an A+? That was an extra echelon that was added to my trauma. So I had both big T trauma and that little t trauma of having to kind of play this role of a perfect person in order to get the praise, instead of saying, okay, A-, good job. What could we do now to get that a little better? Do you feel proud of yourself? Are you happy with yourself? These conversations are really important for children to gain self-esteem and self-confidence. And in the lack of self-esteem and self-confidence, that's where we come in with that mental environment of, I don't think I can make it through the day without alcohol. So it's much more important to look at the culture and the emotional regulation of your childhood than it is to say, were my parents doing these blatantly obvious dysfunctional things? Sometimes it's in those granular, I would say most of it is actually in the granular moments, the minutia of day-to-day activities where you're getting and picking up on little lessons of, oh, I need to work harder to be loved. Oh, I need to avoid conflict to be loved. I need to suppress my actual emotions so that I don't cause conflict or else I'm going to get yelled at. Whatever these styles were, it's really interesting when I went through Dr. Gabor Maté's graduate level program, he had this in all of his seminars too. He had this kind of game when he would have somebody talking, they would open up with, oh, my childhood was great. He would say, all right, give me 2 minutes and I will prove to you where that childhood sadness actually was. Because a lot of times those people with the little t trauma, part of their brain actually tries to normalize the fact that they were expected to be perfect. Everybody must be expected to be perfect all the time, right? They normalize the fact that they had to work very, very hard to be praised. They normalized the idea of suppressing their authentic emotions and expressions because that just must be what everybody does. And as soon as people would start talking about things with him, he would say, oh, that's where it is. So, I really challenge you, especially if you're the type of person that's saying, oh, my life was beautiful. My childhood was great. I don't understand why I'm drinking, to do a little homework of what was the emotional regulation model in your home? Because if you do not know how to calm yourself down, if you were never taught to sit with your feelings and that feelings were natural, that was something for me too. I didn't know that talking about feelings was something that we were allowed to do. That almost made me cry when I said that because I've been so conditioned to suppress emotions because that's the only way that we can have a bright, shiny day. If we don't talk about it, then it never happened. And if it never happened, then we don't have to worry about it. That was kind of what I saw happening in my life. And so for me, because I had all of those emotions suppressed and depressed deep within my soul, I felt like I could erupt at every moment, but I wasn't allowed to. Guess what made me feel confident enough to feel like I was allowed to express my emotions? Alcohol. When I look back at why I drank, that was one of the main things, is that as a kid, I became overly inhibited. I had these very strong inhibitions saying, it's not okay to talk about sadness. It's not okay to have hard conversations. It's not okay to cry. It's not okay to go to your teachers and tell them about what happened at home last night and why you're so tired today. It's not okay to go to your friends and ask them for food off their tray because mom forgot to pack your lunch. All of these things that were necessities for me, I wasn't allowed to talk about it. And even outside of drinking, that might have been the case for you. Maybe your mom or your dad worked triple shifts and they were just trying to put food on the table and they were so busy that they forgot to pack your lunch a few times, and that happened over and over again and you didn't feel safe to talk about it. This is how little t trauma shows up in big ways as well. So in kind of learning that the wrong direction, that I wasn't allowed to talk about my feelings, the moment that I started drinking at the ripe old age of 13 years old, it was like those inhibitions went down and I was finally safe to cry. And I was finally safe to express those things and not be perfect and not do the quote unquote right thing to receive the external validation. The alcohol made me feel safe, but it didn't have anything to do with my genes. It had nothing to do with my mom and the fact that she was an alcoholic by trait. It was that was what I was exposed to as my environmental conditioning. Most modern doctors Everyone that I found is credible. Dr. Jordan Peterson, Dr. Gabor Maté, Dr. Maxwell Maltz, Dr. Joseph Murphy. I could go on and on. They dispel the myth that alcoholism is a genetic disease. Dr. Gabor Maté says that the only genetic predisposition is that there's a gene for emotional sensitivity. And if you can look at, okay, if your parents are very emotional, very sensitive, then that could be passed along to you. But guess why that is an underlying factor? Because think about it. If you feel everything, if you are very sensitive to everything that goes on around you, wouldn't it make sense that then you would need something to help you handle all of that sensitivity, something to take away and soothe and comfort from your hypervigilance and your hyperreactivity? If you're very sensitive, wouldn't it make sense that you lean on a tool to comfort you? Yes. And so if we're going to talk about genetics, that's the only one that is actually studied to show that this is passed along from perhaps a parent who's on the spectrum of alcohol use disorder to a child. But the alcohol is just the tool that we have found to use and battle that sensitivity or comfort that sensitivity. It's not like there's a gene inside of you that says, I'm craving alcohol, and once I have a sip, I got to take it to a 20 drink limit. There's actually none of that that's going on biologically within you. It is all going down in the mind. So what did your childhood teach you? And that's really the exercise for this week. I look back, and again, this is coming from a lot of my own self-study, but I look back at what happened even before my mom started to drink and how my personality now was already starting to show up. So even before my mom started to drink, when I was first born, literally right out, I was born with pneumonia as an infant. And my mom told me stories of how I was in an incubator. She had to leave me at the hospital because I was so sick. She told me over and over throughout my childhood, she would tell me, I thought you were going to die. My dad was deployed. And my brothers, I had Eric, who is 2 years older than me, Jake, who is 9 years older than me. So just imagine this environment, this emotional environment for my mom. She wasn't drinking, but she was a very sensitive person. And she was at home alone with an infant, just having given birth. I don't know now if she could have had postpartum depression, but that could have also been a thing. But having her baby in a hospital, in an incubator, pneumonia so bad that I coughed to the point that I got an umbilical hernia. So I have an outie belly button from that to this day. I got a hernia from coughing so much, went through my belly button. My mom's dealing with that, having just given birth herself, plus 2 boys at home, no help, a very sensitive person. Dad was far away, not able to connect. It was not this age of social media and making WhatsApp calls and FaceTimes. It was writing letters and hoping that we can get a phone call once a month. My mom was alone in that. And how, as an infant, would that have affected me coming out of the hospital? My nervous system being hardwired to my mom, who was anxious, most likely depressed, frazzled, tired, overwhelmed, probably wondering, am I doing enough? Before my mom ever started drinking, I had all of these things, told to me about when I was a toddler, when I was 4 and 5. I remember very vague memories of being told that I was a crybaby. I cried all the time. I was very emotional. If I didn't get my way, I was crying. I was throwing fits and tantrums, and I was already very explosive as an infant, toddler, and even before my mom started drinking. And had my mom never experienced addiction, I could have very well easily still turned out to have a drinking problem because of the way that my emotional regulation was hardwired. There's a quote, and I don't have it pulled up. It just came to my mind, and I'm not going to be able to say it word for word, but there's a great teacher named A.H. Almas, A-L-M-A-A-S. And he says, as an infant, you are hardwired to your mother and to your father, and whatever they are experiencing is going to become your personality, your tendency for emotional regulation. So if your parents are not able to be present emotionally with you when an infant is crying and needs food and needs attention and needs love, then they're going to assume, even as an infant, there must be something wrong with me, that my mom can't feed me. There must be something wrong with me that when I cry, nobody listens. And these are left imprinted on our nervous system, in our body, not as necessarily memories that we can recall, but intrinsic memories, things that pop up through experiences where somebody is ignoring you and all of a sudden your body feels heavy and you're like, why is this person ignoring me? And this is how the past shows up in the present, even without a recollection of a memory. It's everything that we were hardwired from infancy until now. And it always didn't have to do with alcohol. So whether or not your childhood looked like big T trauma or little t trauma, if you're struggling with addiction, if you're struggling on the alcohol use disorder spectrum, there is a root cause. And it's not so much to figure out what happened. Oh, my mom ignored me. Oh, when I needed love, they shunned me. When I was angry, I was put in timeout. So I learned that being angry isn't healthy. It's not so much about figuring out the exact root cause just to ruminate over what happened, but it's about figuring out what happened so that you can gain awareness that you can change and you can heal, that it's not something permanent within you, because you can look back at that experience and change your perception of it. I look back, and when I first kind of would think about my childhood, the pneumonia, then, being really, throwing a lot of tantrums, being very emotional, being very sensitive, and then my mom drinking and losing my brother and all of these things stacking up. When I think about those things, it initially like, well, this is my life. I guess I'm just going to be this way. But as I actually reflect and really dive deep into those things internally, I feel this freedom of saying, okay, now that I know what happened to cause this self-image, to cause this, all of these limiting beliefs, now I have the key to change, because it's not what happens to you, but how you feel about what happens. And now I can look back and I can feel like, okay, it wasn't my fault that these things happen. It wasn't my fault that my mom didn't have the capacity to love me or how I needed it in the moment. It wasn't my fault that the little t traumas occurred, but now that I see them and I spot them, I can work on them internally. So this is my exercise for you this week. If you are someone that might fall into that category of having that picture perfect childhood, but you're still struggling with alcohol, do a little bit of a history check. Just ask mom or dad, family, friends, if you're uncomfortable with talking to mom or dad, ask anybody that was there while you were growing up, what was it like? What was my mom dealing with at that time? What was my dad dealing with at that time? So that you can have compassion for them. It was really easy to be angry at my mom. And then when I looked at it and I was like, well, if I had just popped out a baby and had 2 other babies at home and my husband was deployed and I was all by myself, heck yeah, I'd probably be really anxious to the point where I couldn't calm myself down and my baby would be hardwired for anxiety. So that frees me from the judgment for my mom. That helps me feel better about that. And so I can move on and say, okay, I'm sensitive because this happened, but it doesn't have to be permanent. So do some homework. Ask maybe grandma or grandpa, aunts and uncles, what were mom and dad feeling and experiencing when I was growing up? Because it's hard for you to spot those things if your mind has normalized them. If you walk around saying, yeah, but my childhood was good, I don't understand why I'm like this. I'm not saying to dispel that your childhood was good, but find those precursors for maybe why you're wired this way, why you believe these things about the world or yourself, why you believe these things about your family system. Because again, it's not always about genetics. Carl Miniger said, environment trumps heredity every single time. And I think that that was really liberating for me when I realized it really has nothing to do with my mom and her genetics of drinking, but rather what I learned as a child and having to parent her and having to be perfect for my grandpa and all of these slew of things. So do your homework. If you are somebody that resonates with the ACOA or COA profile, and it's like, yeah, I see these big T traumas, then your exercise is going to be about finding the big T traumas and shifting the way that you feel about them. So for me, I've shared this before of, my anger that I carried around with me that my mom was drinking. Well, that's a big T trauma, but what have I gained from that? Shift my perspective. It's not what happens, but how we feel about what happens. Can I feel like, okay, as a little kid, I grew up really fast because I had a purpose to teach people how to heal. That's just what I've brought from it. That's what I've taken from it. And it's a belief. It might not be 100% factual, but guess what? That belief propels me to do the right thing versus getting lost in alcohol. So what types of positive beliefs can you grab from your big T trauma? And I know this is hard work. This is deep work. You might have to sit with it for a few days and really reflect. But what types of benefits, what types of highlights can you pull from that experience of the big T trauma, of living in a home with alcohol dysfunction? Wherever you are on that spectrum, from little T trauma to big T trauma, my main point today is to dispel your conditioning of it being genetic, because that means that you're either confused because your parents didn't have it. What's wrong with me? How did I get this? Or you think it's permanent because it's been passed along from generation to generations to generation. You have to be able to see that that's not the case. It's all a factor of your external environment as a child that created your internal environment as an adult. So do your homework. Do a little bit of a history check. What were mom and dad experiencing when I was growing up on an emotional level? Were they stressed? Were they anxious? And then on that big T trauma, find the benefits, find the good from those drawbacks. As hard as that sounds, you will be able to change your belief system and make something beautiful out of something that has been painful and traumatic. So with that being said, until next time. Oh, and I'm really excited about next episode. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of moderation. So we're going to be switching gears a little bit. So stay tuned. Can't wait to hear from you and see you next week. Signing out, it's Magnify Maggie. Remember, think different to drink different. It all goes down in the mind. It means the entire world to me that you have been here with me, letting me share my experiences and hopefully helping open your eyes to a bright, beautiful life ahead of you as well. So if you are loving this show, please, please, please subscribe, like, comment, and especially share this with somebody that might be in need. Please help get the word out. Word of mouth is so important. And I know that you're somebody special who can help me in this mission for thinking differently in order to drink differently or never again. Make sure you reach out if you have any questions you want discussed on the podcast. I'm here for it. So I'll talk to you soon. Signing out, Magnify Maggie.